try to summarize what we did the week before, and then we will move on with some new materials. And we will see how far we get today. And next week we will start with Nye and his materials. So last time we saw each other. Last time we talked about Hague and Harrop, authoritarianism, and today we will continue with Hague and Harrop, but I will just do a small summary of what we spoke the last time. As you can remember, we talked about authoritarianism and we talked about traditional authoritarianism, and it's something else than a democratic rule. So we call this actually non-democratic rule. It is a characteristic for traditional authoritarianism that the authority lies with the ruler. The ruler could be a king, a monarch, it could be an individual, but it could also be a dictator type of a person. And people living in that nation, in that state, are called subjects, and they're not considered as fully integrated, fully free and equal citizens. So in order to be able to be a citizen should be able to feel free, and a person of that status should be able to feel safe even when the citizen has critique or commentary against the authority. So in that sense, there is no fear for the citizen. But in case of subjects, when a person is a subject and not a citizen, there is a big difference. Another feature of authoritarian rule is that the rulers feel and behave in a way that they're above the law, and there are no competitive democratic elections. So these are some of the features and characteristics that we talked about the last time, and that Hague and Harrop takes us through in his book on the topic of authoritarianism. And another feature of authoritarian figures is that these rulers have this notion of being a father figure for its children. And we talked about this point, that this is something that comes up too often in patrimonial rule. The father figure believes that he is responsible for his own children, but most of the time there is suppression and there is no free atmosphere or a climate for the citizens or for the subjects to be able to conduct in a way of behavior that can be described as free society. So the idea where there is a link between the ruler and the citizen is in this case absent. For example, other notions, political system-wise notions such as constitution, having a constitution, or having individual rights, or the separation of powers and the rule of law are also very much absent. These are points that we discussed the last time that we saw each other. And then we also talked about this definition of authoritarianism that you can find in your book in Hague and Harrop. So according to this definition, Weber says that notion of patrimonial rule is based on the personal authority. So as you can see that the word patrimonial rule is being associated with personal authority, and a father figure who's obviously a leading male, an alpha male, who rules as if he were the head of a large family. So that's what we actually call the patrimonial rule, some kind of a family notion. We are a family, we're one big family related to each other, which is actually not true. Well, the whole humankind is related to each other. And in that respect, it would be kind of weird to be in a situation of one big family. It kind of in this definition, if we move on, as a father figure, the ruler claims to care for his dependents, for his subjects, for his children, but at the same time, he is dominant, in a dominant position, affirming a relationship of inequality, and that's a very submissive position for the subject living in such a society. So this patrimonial rule is something that we discussed about when you look at the past, from a historical perspective to the Western European life. There was this kind of patrimonial rule between the king and his subjects, and the king, was the person who owned everything, the land and the people, and it was that kind of relationship. So you could say that's how the cookie crumbles. But things have changed very, very fast, especially after the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. This kind of relationship between, this kind of argument, I'm like your father, doesn't work anymore. So, and this is what we understand under authoritarian rule regime. If we move on to the next slide, we've also talked about as examples about the communist states and the fascist states. Communist states being political systems in which a communist party monopolizes power, leading to an all-encompassing bureaucratic state. So there's a lot of big bureaucracy and one political party that rules actually over the whole state or whole nation, just as it was within the Soviet Union until it collapsed in 1989, and which is still the case with China loosening up, actually changing. There is a lot of change going on because of the economic argument that we discussed, because of Organsky, you should remember. And today we sorry about that. When we look at fascism, for example, which is also an anti-democratic, anti-liberal doctrine or regime type, that where the glorification of the personal ruler from him, the personal ruler, to the glorification of the nation as one big happy family, advocates being a warrior state, a nation, a family of state that is all powerful because of its military past. And we have studied, from a scientific point of view, when you look at this whole notion of power, we have seen exactly control of all instruments. It's in the hands of one person, and the fascism has this feature of the warrior state, a military state, and believing that it should be able to glorify itself by power, by the instrument of power. But we studied together Organsky from a scientific point of view, where Organsky says power is not military use. It's not only military, it's how you use all these different instruments, right? And the argument of efficiency, and how the state or the nation uses its bureaucracy, its wealth, its resources, its geography, its climate to its advantage. So in that sense, we talked about authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Sorry about that. And the military rule, which is not really, which is authoritarian, but it's not really ideological. It's only opportunistic seizing of power. And moving on, we could. There are different names for such rulers, chiefs, monarchs, emperors, or presidents, or dictators, as we know them, like Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, and all these very classical dictators of the European past, or Lenin and Stalin, and Mao, obviously, we can include. So important point that Hague and Harrop attracts us to think about is that the authority of this individual is almost unlimited, even though there are rules, and these rules do not apply to to this authoritarian figure. So the person is actually above the law, and in most cases, religion is being used as a divine right. As you can remember in our discussions of approximately maybe 3-4 weeks ago, that we talked about the kings of the Western Europe, where there was this debate, discussion between Locke and Hobbes, and them, making the point that there was this conservative notion during the 17th century that the kings were actually the inheritance or the sons of Adam, and Adam, the prophet Adam, had received his divine right to rule over the whole globe by God. So this kind of thinking that there is a divine right is something that comes up quite often in authoritarian rule. Maybe you've seen the images of Trump where he's surrounded by Christian leaders, spiritual leaders, touching him on the shoulders and praying together. And I remember Bush Jr. Saying that he was actually sent by God and chosen by God. So this power position does something with people, and now you also see that Trump actually resists transferring the position of power to President-elect Biden. So there is also succession. You also see that succession moving from the authority moves from father to son on hereditary basis, and this is kind of maintaining the fictional descent from God, Adam to his son, and that way to the kings and the queens, etc., etc. So Hague and Harrop also says in his book, he argues that authoritarian rule is also very, very common for static agricultural societies with little need of government. So if people are out there on the land working, and as long as they're happy and things don't go wrong, why would you need a government? So this whole democratic process, we talked about the theory of modernization, and we saw in that theory that people working on land move from agricultural economy because of the Industrial Revolution to cities, where affluence, welfare, and the living standards started to increase. And people started to think about their own personal interests, getting into politics and economy and becoming merchants and questioning and asking questions and commenting and criticizing the people in power. And so this is we talked about this very slow and long process from agricultural to the mercantilist or the capitalist way of thinking. So we're not saying that the capitalist way is better. We're not saying anything about what is better or what is good or bad. As intellectuals, as researchers, we're just trying to see the patterns, how these things are interrelated with each other. So in this case, authoritarianism has some kind of relationship with agricultural societies. And there is an argument to say for modernization theory in terms of urbanization, in terms of emancipation of subjects into citizens and becoming middle class people who can think for themselves. So I'm a big proponent of education and people educating themselves for knowledge and understanding, and discarding fear or the fear of threat, which is a way to control dependent minds. So I'm a big proponent of education. So allegiance is owed in this case to the ruler rather than the rules. Okay, politics is based on personal relationships. So moving on to the next slide, communism and fascism are two good examples for authoritarianism or totalitarianism in the reconstruction of the human nature and the human society as well as its culture. Moving on, we talked about the difference between totalitarianism and authoritarianism. Totalitarian regimes aim for 100 complete total penetration of society in an attempt, at least in theory, to transform it. So the difference is that you have at the bottom the military rule, which does not have an ideology. It's more or less opportunistic, and then above that you would have authoritarianism, which might have an ideological approach to it. It might be such as in case of communism. It might have a complete set of ideas and ideologies, but it becomes totalitarian the moment that the state has a complete interference in the personal lives of people and determining what happens to these people. So we've given these two examples. Let's go a little bit more forward and look at sorry about that. Okay, these are points that we have actually discussed a little bit. We're just summarizing and also mentioned these points, and then we also obviously talked about China. But you know, the difference in China is that you remember what Organsky said about China in the future, and how China might use its own power instruments in becoming a global power. But there's a counter argument that which says that China, or the communist rule, the authoritarian one-party system in China might be loosening up, becoming more state capital society, allowing personal wealth and individuals becoming private owners in their own personal sphere. So the argument actually kind of reminds us of the theory of modernization and what will happen to China as long as Chinese individuals grow into cities, develop further, and they might even start demanding and critiquing and criticizing the political situation. So there is a chance that if modernization theory might be applied to the Chinese situation, that the future of China as an authoritarian rule might obviously change. But this is something for future reference, and we cannot certainly say anything about it. What we can say is that it is going to be very, very interesting, and China is going to keep us busy in the next decades coming.